Hey, welcome back. I'd like to end up talking about a very serious topic, communicating with your GM. I just ended up coming back from a game that kind of ended up rattling me a bit. Star Wars setting, and while I'm a casual fan of the Star Wars game, I'm by no means a rabid fan. Now, what it is that there we go, got these all fixed up. Now I feel somewhat symmetrical. But eventually, afterwards, one of the things that I like to end up doing is I like to sit down with my GM after a game. Yeah. Now, oftentimes, you know, most GMs that I know or have worked with previously like to end up knowing how they did, what the characters liked about the game, what didn't they like, and all this kind of stuff. Which is a nice catch-all if you're looking for group support, and sometimes that'll happen. What I end up finding more often than not is that when asking a group about something that you've put this much effort into, everybody wants to be supportive, and that's great. Especially for budding GMs, that's one of the best ways to get support. The problem is that some people are hesitant to end up stepping forward with a criticism or anything like that, and it becomes a little bit difficult if you're not sure what you want to end up doing from that point on. Let me give you a simple example. One of the things that I ended up running into a couple of years back is that I had a GM who just struggled to do anything outside of the book. When I say this, I mean if it didn't involve attack modifier, damage, anything like that, skill checks, that kind of thing, they struggled with it. I mean, how do you explain and calculate that you are wrapping a chain around the ogre's throat and then having somebody with a 4-horse wagon pull to end up dragging this thing over the next 3 kilometers, right? While kind of awesome, there's not much for damage tables when it comes down to being dragged along dirt road. It's kind of one of those things you got to make a call. And because of that, there's a lot of the players, they were fine with this. We'll roll damage and all this kind of stuff. Unfortunately, if you end up knowing me for any length of time, you know that this is not how I end up operating. I once tried to end up grabbing hold of a creature's head and shoving it into the ceiling using his psionic powers, and then end up using the ceiling to cheese grate its own face off. These are the kinds of combats I get involved in, and they're fun. They're great fun, especially when you're allowed to let your imagination go wild and just think, okay, what's in the scene and what can I use as an improvised wrestling or improvised weapon? Hailing from the old chant of ECW. I absolutely love those kinds of things. However, the GM didn't know this. So things just kept going. And, being still young, I didn't want to end up throwing him off his game and then making him believe that he was a shit GM. When reality was he was still learning. You got to give that little bit of credence. But if you're not talking with your GM, you're not learning anything. And they're not learning anything. Communication between players and GM is very crucial. And this is before the game, after the game, during character creation. Your background should be telling your GM what it is that you expect out of this game. Sad truth is that most of us write a background and then that background's never referenced. It's never brought back. When in reality, that was leading up to the story that we would like to get involved in. Even give us like 1 or 2 sessions to play this out. Just yes, okay, here was the guy who killed my family, and I finally ended up getting revenge or sought out justice. Maybe here's an old family heirloom that has finally come back, but it's cursed, And why is that? Maybe your character is an assassin, but why is it that he's no longer hired as one? Why is he now an adventurer? Well, what happens when that old failed assassination comes back to haunt him? These are all great stories that you can end up saying, but if your GM doesn't really know them, or doesn't know that's what you're expecting, how the heck can he end up running them? Now, don't get me wrong, GM's not off the hook. It's on the GM to end up talking to the players as well. But the GM is busy trying to organize the game, trying to end up wrangling a bunch of cats that he calls players into the same room or same Skype call or whatever else. Hangouts is my preferred. And things just don't organize like that. It's kind of a shame, but it's true. So I would say it's usually better, speaking as a player, to end up going out and actually getting, their time. Talk to your GM. Talk to him. What do you think's going right? What do you think's going wrong? There's a few ways to end up going about this, but the first thing I would say is don't make it about the group. Okay? You can't affect what player B, C, and D are doing. You just can't, okay? A player's going to do what the player's going to do. Sometimes you don't agree with it, and that's too bad. Sometimes, it might be an inexperienced player. Maybe it's a player who doesn't feel like there is anything needing to change or anything that might help out. Maybe they just don't want to hear it. That's fine. That happens. Your goal is to keep communication with the GM. Because if you have an idea about your character, the direction you want to go, and they hear this and they go, that would be a good story. Oh, yeah, we can have some fun with that. They might start incorporating it a little bit more, might push you to the forefront, might help you out in building things up. But if they don't know, they can't change anything. Maybe there is an issue with the game itself. Like you feel that you're not contributing. Maybe you feel like you're constantly being pushed to the background. The GM needs to know these things, and unfortunately, they don't read minds. How much easier would it be as a GM if you could actually read the minds of your players? I mean, besides the ones who are trying to end up getting away by checking Facebook on their phone underneath the table, and you're assuming that they're doing something else. Yeah. Well, we've all been there. And for those of you who haven't, appreciate that. Still, when you have to end up dealing with these situations, as a GM, you want to try and take hold of those little tidbits. At the end of the day, a GM is responsible only for setting up the situation and helping the players tell the story. I know that sounds weird. Now, every other GM tries to end up making up stories, but the reality is you're not making up stories. You're just making events. It's actually the players who are telling the story. They're telling the story by saying what the characters do. What are these protagonists up to? Which is great. If they can end up maintaining that, all the more. But this all comes down to the communication. Now, potential issues that can crop up. All right. First off, criticism. Okay. Try and keep it constructive. Okay. If you're just moaning that a player isn't doing something right or the GM isn't doing something right, that doesn't help facilitate building something out of it. Trying to end up salvaging something and making it rise to the occasion. What it is just there to beat a weakness over the head. No GM wants to hear that. No player wants to hear that. No human being wants to hear that. And while you might end up being a hard ass who says, I'm going to tell it as it is, if you're going to be that guy, you're telling it as it is, better be tell it as it is to make things better. Reality is that I've seen more than a few players driven out of the hobby who were perfectly good, yeah, players. Some of them even good GMs, but they got driven out of the hobby because they felt like they couldn't do anything right because every single week everybody was telling them, you screwed this up, you screwed that up. What the hell's going on here? You can do this. Engage with them. Engage with the fact engage with the fact that they're a human being just like you, fallible, and all those kinds of wonderful little tidbits that end up making the human experience so interesting. And then have a minute. Let them understand what it is that's going on with you. And I don't mean like personal lives or anything like that, though that if that is an issue, go ahead. Particular things might affect you, but the GM is not a mind reader. Let me give you an example. In a Vampire the Masquerade game, I play a Malkavian. I love Malkavians. Malkavians are probably one of my favorite clients to play. But there's a particular derangement I refuse to play because I end up suffering from clinical depression. More to the point, major depression with some details that I'm not all too proud of, but the GM doesn't always know that. So when they start hucking derangements at me, they might end up giving depression. And I'll tell my GM, I won't play it. I refuse to take it. And for the simple grounds of I don't want in-character and out-of-character experiences bleeding over. That is, while I could play it, it's something that I don't want any part of, and I'm uncomfortable as a player. Maybe you are uncomfortable with other things. Maybe it's overt sexual content. Maybe hyper-violence actually gets to you. Maybe you have a particular belief structure that makes it difficult for particular scenes. You need to talk to your GM about these things. You need to be able to make sure that you're both on the same page because at the end of the day, you're both responsible for each other's enjoyment. Now, when you end up approaching them, the other thing that'll end up happening when you're talking to a GM outside of criticism is you're trying to end up giving them ideas. You want your character to go in this direction, but you may not know enough about the world in order to end up saying how that direction would work. Maybe it's a homebrew campaign. Maybe it's set in something that you're not used to. For myself, like I said, one of the ones I end up having is Star Wars. Okay, my advanced knowledge just comes down to the fact that I know what TIE stands for, and to my understanding, that's Twin Ion Engine. Outside of that, I don't know what language the Hutts speak. I don't know the Dagobah system inside and out. I couldn't even tell you what species Yoda is. And somebody who's never seen Star Wars, rare as they may be, but they're out there. Even what I just said is complete Greek to them. They have no idea what the heck I'm talking about. So you're going to need to end up taking that into account. And the first thing that comes down to is you got to tell your GM this. Look, I don't understand what a Wookiee is. Can you explain it to me? Can you describe it? And that helps the GM because they don't want to describe something that everybody assumes. I'm going to say there's a broom in the corner. I'm not going to say there's a long wooden pole with a piece of wood attached to it with stiff bristled hairs attached to it, the hundreds of thousands all pointing in the same direction. And it's dusty and maybe has a few things crawling in it due to disuse, just sitting, leaning in the corner. No, I'm just going to say it's a broom. But if somebody doesn't know what a broom is, well, then the description of a broom kind of becomes a moot point because they don't know. And I know that's an obvious one, but that's how it oftentimes feels, especially to an uninitiated player. What's another bit of communication that might end up happening with the GM? You might feel and I think I touched on this earlier, that you're not contributing in some way. You feel like you're kind of being left out in the dust. Well, you're going to need to do a little bit of searching yourself and figuring out why that is. Keep in mind, the GM is not your universal problem solver. They want to help. They want to make that game experience as fun for you and for them as possible. But if they don't know what's broke, they can't fix it. So before coming to them, really try and understand what it is that's bugging you. If you feel your character is not developed enough, maybe ask them for some time to end up doing a one-on-one session to end up fleshing out the backstory. What was it really like before you broke out of that prison cell? What was it like before you were released from the Royal Guard? What was it like when you were just a street urchin stealing bread to feed your family? One other thing. When communicating with a GM, do one last thing above all else. Thank them. Running a game, I would arguably say, is one of the most thankless jobs you will ever have. Everybody will say thank you at the end, but that's a cordial thing. And just said because that's a social expectation. If you really are enjoying that game, let your ST or your GM know about it. Because oftentimes, they'll run session after session after session, and it can get grating if you feel like no one's involved. The fact that you will go out of your way to talk to them about the game afterwards and list your concerns and try and express an excitement over a direction, or just discussing trying to find one and letting those creative juices flowing, batting things back and forth, it matters a lot. And I'll say this. There's nothing more satisfying than when I have a player who's batting ideas with me. Because eventually, I don't need to figure out what plot hooks to get him to come along on the journey with me and have him take me down those unknown roads. He's going to do the work for me. Till next time.